Hello there everyone, this is uxwbill. You're looking at a Power Macintosh G4 mirrored drive door model, affectionately, or not so affectionately, referred to by some as the Windtunnel, due to potential fan noise issues. This is a computer that someone gave me, and I've taken it far enough with a Debian PowerPC Linux bootable disk to know that it's actually functional. Now, at some point in the future, I might go ahead and do a fairly detailed review and look at this machine. But for right now, this is going to be just a quick video to get this machine up and running, see what we've got and what we might be able to do with it. And I actually have a reason for doing this. I have a PowerPC G4 Mac Mini over in my AirSat server room opposite the computer mess room that has been running for years. Like I say, I bought the machine new in, 2005 or thereabouts. It shipped with macOS 10.3. I upgraded it to 10.4. I think it shipped with 10.3. Suffice it to say, it's been through a lot. It's never had a clean installation of the operating system done, and one of the things that I've noticed with that machine is that it's nigh unto unusable on the modern internet, even with severe measures like no script, ad blocking, things along those lines taking place. 10.4 Fox is a wonderful effort, and I'm glad that someone is trying their best to keep the PowerPC Macintosh machines equipped with a modern, capable, and secure web browser, but unfortunately, I'm a patient person, and it just exceeds my tolerance for waiting around. So what I'm going to do is make this machine functional just as quickly as I can. Got the things here that I should need in order to do that. I have some operating system software. This is macOS 10.5 Leopard, probably not the best choice for a PowerPC machine such as this. I know it's nowhere near as well optimized as Tiger, but it was what I could get my hands on the most readily, so it's what I got, and I figure it will probably work. My initial experiences with this software were not very positive. It was very, very buggy as I remember it, especially the server version. But by the time of 10.5.8 and several security updates, they'd gotten to the point where it did essentially work. I still had problems with servers occasionally going loopy on that release. I have a hard drive that was given to me by another member of my family, contingent on my wiping it under their supervision, so I did so. And then I have the part I didn't get with this machine. You see, it's free. There has to be a catch somewhere, something I didn't get. This is the drive cage. It's kind of questionable to put $15 into a free computer, but that's exactly what I did, and I had to pay something for the operating system too. Luckily, it seems that this machine is pretty decently equipped. It's got some scuffs and scratches on its body. This is, I believe, the 1 gigahertz model. Let's go ahead and take a better look at that here. Assembled in USA. That's something you wouldn't see too often anymore. I really thought the camera light would help us see that, but it doesn't seem to have turned out that way. You can see that this machine is clocked at 1 gigahertz, but more interesting to me is the DP notation on the back. Now, near as I can tell, this EMC number refers only to the single processor variant of this machine. But I think this might be a dual processor unit, in which case it ought to perform quite nicely. Has an ATI Radeon video card with it. I believe that's what that is, and I think it's a Radeon 7500. There's some generic USB 2.0 card and an empty slot. Don't know what it once had in it. Really don't know what this computer did in its previous life because, as previously mentioned, someone pulled the hard drive and they took the carrier with them. I wish they wouldn't have done that. At least they were nice enough to leave me the screw that holds it in, so I don't have to say anything too terribly bad about them. Not that I would here on video. I'd reserve my ranting privately later on. Here's the heatsink for the microprocessor. Very large fan. Interestingly laid out power supply. Looks like something that would come out of a 1 or 2 unit rack-mounted server. I read on Wikipedia that these machines were apparently modeled after the Xserve G4, so maybe that's why they used a power supply like that. This is where the appellation Windtunnel comes from, and apparently these power supplies are also somewhat failure-prone, but at least this one is working so far. We have a completely dead PRAM battery. I'll have to replace that at some point. a little tiny fan. I'm not sure why they included that unless they were trying to circulate air over the optical drives. This machine actually has 2 optical drives in it. I guess somebody added one at some point in time. They are both functional, in at least the sense that both of them will come open. Here's the video card. There's the USB adapter. 64-bit wide PCI slots, although you won't see a lot of expansion cards making use of that. And a place for a modem, which this machine doesn't actually have. A telephone modem, and also the airport wireless fidelity card, Wi-Fi card. So let's go ahead and get a hard drive into this thing. This isn't a how-to video. Like I say, I just want to get this machine up and running quickly and see what I've got and what I don't. Alright, I have returned. The hardest part of this whole task was actually finding a suitable USB attached mouse, which I did manage to come up with, although it's not a very good one since it's not a nice optically tracked model. Looking at this logic board once again for just a brief moment, one thing you might have noticed are the plethora of ATA connections on this system board, all of varying capability and purpose. You can see there's an ATA33 connection that's going off to the optical drives, an open ATA66 connection, and I think there might even be ATA100 capability on this board. It's my understanding, based on what I've read about these, that not all of these ATA channels can be used, and while it would have been very early days for such things, I'm minorly surprised that this system doesn't have some serial ATA capability, because it was right around the corner when this thing would have been brand new, and some of the competition over in the Intel world certainly would have had the ports, even if there wasn't a usage for them yet. Luckily, I have plenty of serviceable parallel ATA drives to hand, so that is definitely not a problem. Go ahead and close this up. And before we turn it on, I just wanted to share with you the basement cricket. I don't know what it is with the crickets, but they are everywhere as the weather's cooling off and we're heading for winter. Listen very carefully and you might hear it. It's over behind the dehumidifier somewhere, I know that much. Of course, every time you try to get close to it, it stops making noise. But this thing is going to start making noise, at least if the power supply hasn't managed to expire between the time I tested it and now. I'll go ahead and turn this monitor on. It's an HP monitor, but it has a shiny panel in it, as I'm sure you can see. Seemed like an appropriate thing, given that Apple really pioneered the use of shiny LCD panels. I personally don't really care for them, but that's neither here nor there. Let's see if we can persuade this thing to go ahead and take an operating system. Hold down the mouse button here in the hopes of triggering the optical drive to open. I think both of them will open, actually. That is really ridiculously loud. Okay, there's my Debian CD that I burned. So you can see I wasn't making that up. Let's go ahead and shake this out of the box here. Close that drive. I don't know if these are both DVD capable or not, but we'll see. It's looking for a source of media to start up from. I hear the optical drive moving around, so I think it's going to manage to do something. Alright, well, I'm sure that many of you out there have seen an installation of Mac OS X before. This is it booting in verbose mode, so you get a lot of technical information. But it looks like we've had a disaster. Looks like it crashed. Well, that's not a good sign. I don't know what's up with that. I guess I'll have to fiddle around with it and see if I can actually get it to start. I know it was more than willing to boot and run Debian Linux, but maybe there's something slightly wrong with this machine. Could be some bad RAM or something. Mac OS X is typically very picky about that. Here's the system's model name, in case you're curious about that. I guess I'll just have to fiddle around with this and see if I can get it to pop, and if I do, I'll be back with this system at a fully updated Mac OS X desktop. Well, I must say that was certainly impressive. The machine did make it into Mac OS X. Apparently one of the optical drives just really doesn't like the installation disk, or maybe it's bad. Maybe it's partially flaky. I've certainly seen that kind of thing before. Like I say, it was willing to boot Debian Linux on a CDR. Go figure, huh? But just before this thing hit the installation language prompt, it went into full-on Windtunnel mode. Listen to the amount of noise this system is making. That's just absolutely insane. I hope it's not going to be like that in regular operation, because if it is, this machine is going to be a shelf queen. Here's a quick look at the system profiler screen. I was correct about one thing. This is definitely a dual processor machine. You can see it right there. Number of CPUs is 2, clocked at 1 gigahertz. See if I can go 2 for 2, or is that 3 for 3? See if I figured out correctly what the graphics adapter is, and apparently no, I did not. It's a GeForce 2 MX. It's not very powerful for a machine like this. So let's go ahead and see if we can prepare the hard drive for use here. Just like I'm a fairly patient person, I don't mind noisy computers. Quite okay with them most of the time, but this is just crazy. Alright, it's time to see if this can be done. Well, I must say there is at least one good thing that came of this, and maybe this is why the computer kicked up its fans. It heard me complaining about the cricket. It's not impossible to hear the cricket, but it's a lot harder than it was previously. I'm almost tempted to go upstairs and see if I can hear this thing in the living room. The answer, if you can believe it, and I'm not entirely surprised by this, to be perfectly honest, is that yes, I can hear that computer up here in the living room. I can't hear it real well, and I'm not sure that this camcorder with its rather hissy microphone preamp will be able to convey what I hear accurately to you, but we'll give it a try. It might work better if I go over here to this air return. It might be even more audible there. I don't know that it's going to register, but those of you who typically watch my videos with headphones on, you've probably got the best chance of anyone of hearing what that computer was doing. That's just incredible. Wow. Yeah, this thing is definitely going to need some attention. Every now and again it gets a little bit uppity about stuff. Its most recent fit was thrown when Mac OS X tried to start up for the first time and was playing its little introductory ditty. Decided to bail out on me then. So I don't know quite what's wrong with it. I might have to poke and prod it a little bit more just to see what's going on. But first I'm going to bring the software up to date. And while the machine does quiet down, it never stays quiet for very long. And I really have a hard time believing that the microprocessor is being kept that busy so as to be throwing off that much heat and requiring this machine to produce so much noise. Just unbelievable. I don't know, I guess the CPU is busier than I thought it might be. For those of you who are still watching this particular video, remember when I said at the beginning that I'd hoped this would be a short, sweet, and to-the-point video? Turns out I probably never should have said that, because by saying so I believe I condemned myself to a feature-length extravaganza, though I know there are many of you in the crowd who love that sort of thing. I think I've discovered what's wrong with this computer. I think I have an overheating problem. One of the things that you should never ever do is assume that the previous owner of anything maintained it correctly, bothered to get it put back together correctly, or just plain didn't do something stupid while they were working with it that leads to behavior you can't quite explain. You should question everything, and you should definitely start with the basics. Speaking of the basics, here is a very large, I am told this weighs 4 pounds, but it feels heavier than that, block of aluminum. This is responsible for cooling the microprocessor assembly, and if ever there were any doubts about this thing's dual processor nature, they can be thoroughly put to rest at this point. Well, if you look at these chips very, very closely, particularly the center die, which is where good thermal contact with that large aluminum heatsink would be absolutely critical, you'll notice there's next to no thermal interface or heatsink compound on there. And I don't know why. I can't imagine that Apple would have done that way originally. I have very strong reason to believe that someone was probably fooling around with this machine. You can see there's a little bit more thermal interface material on the metal side of the heatsink as opposed to the microprocessors themselves. And if you look around, you can also just barely make out a fingerprint. And I'm pretty sure that's not my fingerprint because I have taken great pains to stay away from these thermal interface pads or heatsink compound. I doubt it's a pad. It looks more like regular compound to me, but it doesn't really matter because what's there is clearly not enough. However, that by itself probably wouldn't lead to the strange occasional behavior that I've been seeing. One of the things that I noticed when I took this assembly apart, during which point I managed to somewhat mangle the modem connection, but that's okay because this machine doesn't have it, so I simply clipped it out, and I may cover over that hole with something because I'm never going to need a telephone modem in this machine. But the thing that I noticed is that there were only 3 screws that were holding this in. There was one back here, there was one back here as part of this assembly, and there was one over here, but there's a post over here, and I've got no corresponding screw to go with it, which means the heatsink was somewhat loose on this base plate assembly, and this microprocessor board is not held in here very securely to start with. You might think that these were some kind of screw holes, but I don't think they are. You have to be careful with this. This connector is very, very fragile. If you bend any pins in it, a greater woe than mangling an LGA 775 socket will befall you. And I think you can see why that thing might be considered very, very fragile. Last time I had one of these apart, I was installing a Sunet Technologies 1.8 gigahertz G4 upgrade in a Quicksilver O2 machine. I was sweating bullets the whole time, man. I've never mangled one of these, and I certainly don't want to, but I think you can see where the opportunity for doing so is just incredibly ripe. But one thing I'm not very sure about, it looks like there ought to be screw holes here, or maybe posts through which that heatsink would fit, and there aren't any. Doesn't look like there's any provision for them in the motherboard. I mean, yeah, it's cut open in spots, but under most of those, there's actually other components on the board, so it's not like you could drill it if you wanted to. Of course, this being a multi-layer board, that would be an extraordinarily stupid thing to do. Another thing I don't quite understand, I don't know what the purpose of this black guide piece is. I'm not really sure how that works, or even how that's meant to sit on there. It looked like it had maybe ridden up a little bit, which is kind of odd because I've left this machine open since I was fiddling with it last night. That's right, it's now a night later, and I'm just getting around to investigating this problem. And I'll tell you what finally tipped me off. I installed a thermal monitoring utility. I'll post a link to it down in the video description. And of course, this machine has some thermal sensors that can be tapped into under software, through software means. I discovered that while it was sitting there idling, the microprocessor cores were at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 163 degrees Fahrenheit while they were just idling. And that would definitely be the recipe for a fan, such as this large one back here, which is what I think we were actually hearing the other night, to rev itself up just as far as it could. The air coming out of the back of this machine wasn't hot. That's another telltale sign that something's not quite right, because a heat sink that's doing its job ought to get hot to the touch, and Apple strongly insinuates by the presence of this sticker that such should definitely be the case. But I think this missing screw, and the poor application of thermal transfer or heatsink compound were both conspiring together to create this overheating issue, and that is why the machine was occasionally flipping out on me. In other words, maybe this topmost optical drive is actually fine, and I just happened to catch the machine at one of those bad times when it flipped out. Anytime that it did flip out, it was always doing something. It wasn't just sitting there idle. I'm kind of surprised, based on what I think I've learned here, that the system was actually able to get through the installation and all of its software updates. I guess maybe the PowerPC G4 microprocessor, the 7447 as I believe it's technically known, is a lot more robust than something like, say, a Pentium 3, 4, or an AMD Athlon. Those will either freeze up immediately, try to downclock to protect themselves, and then free up, or as someone once suggested on one of my videos after making a comment about Core on the Cob, I said that if you overclock that one too far, you'd get popcore. And that's definitely what AMD Athlon microprocessors do if you run them without a heatsink. They make flames and then they blow a hole in your motherboard, which isn't cool at all. But I guess the PowerPC G4 is able to soldier on pretty much almost perfectly for almost all of the time, even when it's not being cooled properly. And while I think I may have been sidetracked a little bit when I said it, this screw being missing over here seems to make the heatsink rest unevenly on that board, which isn't as well supported as it could be. Now, sometimes I just don't understand the things that Apple gets up to in their hardware design. Some things they do so very, very well and elegantly, and then others, you just kind of have to wonder, what were they thinking? Or were they thinking at all, for that matter? And sometimes the answer seems to be less than what we would hope. Anyway, there is something interesting on the board over here. A lot of these machines, I know the Quicksilver 2001 and 2002 variants, use a TriPath Class T audio amplifier that's usually mounted on the reverse side of the motherboard. That's right, these are actually populated on both sides. I wonder if this heatsink that's sticking up here is actually cooling for that audio output chip. Unfortunately, the only thing you can use with that, unless of course you were to cook up some sort of a cabling adapter, are those spherical style Apple speakers that I believe Harman Kardon had some sort of input into their design. If only from a technical perspective. I suppose Apple did all the design themselves. So it looks like I've got an overheating problem here that I need to deal with. I'll have to go to the hardware store. Unfortunately, I don't hold out much hope that they can hook me up with the screws that I need to have. Let's see if we can actually get that to focus. I don't know if that'll actually focus. Oh, there it did. I'm impressed. But I'll have to go to the hardware store and see if I can find a screw like that, because I wasn't able to find anything in my personal collection that had either an appropriate thread pitch or was long enough to mate with these threads and hold things together like it was supposed to. So for right now, this project has reached a standstill, and I'm debating, do I upload this video as it is right now, leave things the way they are, tell you what I've come here to tell you, and preserve some semblance of brevity, although I think this is running to at least 25 minutes by this point, or do I simply continue the adventure in this particular video? I'm kind of leaning towards starting a whole new video, working with a clean slate. What I can tell you so far, the thing that I came here to find out, was whether or not the 10.4 Fox web browser was actually capable of performing better on this machine than it does my Mac Mini. While this machine is clocked slower and certainly has a far less capable video card in it than the G4 Mac Mini I have in the other room, it does have the added benefit of a second processor core, and I can tell it definitely makes some difference, even under software that's not as well optimized for PowerPC as macOS 10.4 Tiger was, compared to Leopard, which is actually what this thing is running right now. So I have definitely learned a lot of things. I've got some problems to solve, and I thank you all for watching this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. A good ramble through a somewhat interesting computer, something of an end of an era for Apple computer. This was the most powerful and yet still expandable PowerPC G4 system they ever released, or at least this machine is in the same family. There was one that went slightly faster than this. It had onboard FireWire 800 hardware that this machine lacks, and it could not boot into Mac OS 9. I wouldn't have actually cared too much if I'd have ended up with that model, because I have other machines which I can run Mac OS 9 quite nicely on, such as my 9600 350, which is a pretty rare bird from what I've heard. I guess a lot of people simply opted for a beige G3 when Apple said they were having production difficulties with that machine. But all of that is a story for another time. I think this video is going to come to an end at this point, as well it should. I thank you all for watching, and I certainly hope you'll leave an interesting and insightful comment if you have something to add.